Early in the roll call, before we came on to the national Fox network, there was quite a lot of disruption. In fact, very unusual amount of disruption in the Senate gallery. There are 121 public seats there, and anyone after they pass through security can come and sit in the gallery. And in fact, they're strictly admonished. You're not allowed to show either any support or any disagreement with any decision or any statement that's made. You're there to sit and watch the senators do what they did. But when they began the roll call, it sounded mostly like female voices shouting very much in opposition to the Kavanaugh nomination, and particularly when Jeff Flake, who was considered one of the key swing votes, was voting for Kavanaugh. You could hear one of the female protesters up in the Senate gallery shout and call Flake a coward, and she was escorted out. We're told of those 121 seats left.
Mr. Carper.
Here we go. Waiting for some stragglers, and I can tell you these senators.
Carper, no.
Waiting for stragglers, and as I say, these senators very much want to get on planes and fly home. It is a holiday weekend, and they want to go back to their states, but they're waiting for this vote to be completed. So whoever it is that hasn't voted yet is not going to be popular.
Looks like we got the final vote in that we're going to get today.
As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate gallery. Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or change a vote? If not, on this vote, the ayes are 50, the nays are 48. The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask consent the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
I suggest the absence of quorum.
Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The clerk will call the roll.
And so after 3 long months, the nomination, which came on July 9th, and the confirmation, which comes today, Brett Kavanaugh is officially confirmed to the Supreme Court and will take his seat on the court on Tuesday after the Columbus Day holiday. Please stay tuned to Fox News Channel and this Fox station for continuing coverage of this story. I'm Chris Wallace.
And I'm Shannon Bream in Washington. All right, let's bring back our panel here in Washington as we have just watched this moment in history. Mo, I'll start with you. We talked a little bit as we were waiting for this vote to go forward. There have been strenuous protests at every turn. It's now official that Judge Kavanaugh will become Justice Kavanaugh. 2 oaths he'll need to take to make that happen before he goes to the high court. But where does the resistance or the fight against this process, as we saw it play out, where does it go next?
I think Senator Schumer probably said it best, and that is it's going to take place at the ballot box. I think, yeah, I'm sure there will be some protests. We were talking off camera earlier about how there may be some protests on his first day seated, and I would be surprised if there weren't. But the place to affect change is at the ballot box. We've heard people on both sides say elections have consequences, and so for those on the left who feel that this process was unfair, feel that Judge, now soon to be Justice Kavanaugh, is going to make rulings antithetical to what they believe, there's really one recourse, and that is to vote.
Carrie, the Judicial Crisis Network, very supportive of Judge Kavanaugh. You have been out speaking very much on his behalf throughout this long process. Your thoughts now that it's official?
Well, I'm just so proud of how this process has ended, despite the circus-like atmosphere really from the get-go in this process. Judge Kavanaugh is someone who has a track record of 12 years on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. He's someone who is a seasoned judge and who in that time really developed an amazing reputation for his even-handedness, for being willing to listen to both sides of the argument, for going in intentionally non-political, non-partisan. And I think now he will pick up and continue that on the Supreme Court. It's a good day for that court to have someone of his stature there joining those justices, and I know that he's someone known for his collegiality as well. So I think it's going to be a good contribution to the court in that front as well.
What do you think, though, when you look at these pictures of protesters? And I will say there are some pro-Kavanaugh protesters here, supporters here. I've seen some signs that said "Believe Kavanaugh," but you've got to assume the vast majority of these folks are upset with how the Senate has voted today. Do you worry about that this has unleashed a reaction in the country?
I think we've seen, as Leader McConnell said, actually a huge reaction, maybe on both sides, but certainly what I have been struck by is hearing the number of people who, for example, have written to me or receiving social media messages, things talking about how incensed they are at the lack of due process being shown here, at the willingness to throw aside, as Professor Dershowitz was saying, all civil libertarian principles of innocent until proven guilty. That's not just about trials. That's a fundamental American value. That's a fundamental value of Western society. And we need to not be willing to, just because we may disagree with someone on policy or on their judicial philosophy, throw aside all of that in a no-holds-barred effort to defeat them. That's what was so discouraging about this process. But what I am happy to see then is how many people saw that and said, that's not the direction we want to go. And I would hope that some people also on the left would see it, hey, you know what, let's not do this going forward. We can have a reasoned debate about judicial philosophy, and that's appropriate. But threats, intimidation, like Senator Collins and others have experienced, and just shouting and disruption like we saw today, we saw during his hearing, that's not actually the best way to have a reasonable argument about these things.
Charlie, in watching this over the last few weeks, I was struck by a different tone from the president. We did see him flare up a little bit Monday night at his rally, where he does get wound up and often go off the prompter. But really, over the last few weeks, it's as if he was able to resist a lot of his impulses with regard to Twitter and other things that he may have wanted to say about these accusers. For the most part, it was a very disciplined showing by him.
It really was. And if you think about it, Shannon, you go back to the way President Trump has handled this issue from even before the election. When he realized what an important issue this was for Republicans and what a potent tool it could be to get him elected, and he went along with those lists, a highly unorthodox thing for a candidate to do. But he remained very disciplined about it, and one of the most effective claims that people would try to make to conservatives is, you don't know who he's going to nominate. You don't know that he's going to stick to that list. And conservatives are like, I hope he will. I hope he's not going to vote for put up Judge Judy. But anything can happen. And so not only did he stay disciplined through it, but then once he got elected, he's kept to his word on those things. And it's that discipline on this issue that I think is one of the most important aspects of his success. But something tells me he's probably going to let loose tonight. The rally tonight, I think that maybe Judge Kavanaugh's name will come up a couple of times, and I think all the pent-up discipline that we've seen the last couple of weeks will be let down at that point.
Yeah,
I just want to say, though, because I do think that moment you referenced, Shannon, where the president at that rally where he openly mocked Dr. Ford was a galvanizing moment for both sides, right? I think a lot of Judge Kavanaugh's supporters who are feeling frustrated by the process, we saw it in the crowd that was in that arena that night, cheered the president on. We're laughing along with him. But there are a lot of people on the left who saw that. He may have been disciplined everywhere else, but saw that moment and were appalled. And a lot of the Republican senators were appalled. That, I think, will come back to haunt come Election Day.
Panel, hold on here. We'll come back to you in a moment. There has been muted reaction thus far from the many protesters gathered outside the Supreme Court and the Capitol. Let's go to Leland Vittert now on the street among the protesters outside the Capitol. Leland, set the scene for us.
Well, Chris, you were right earlier when you said the vast majority here were people anti-Kavanaugh, and there was sort of this shudder that took over the crowd when the tally with the vote was announced, and then shame, shame, shame chanting from the crowd. And we've heard that before. Hard to know exactly who all of these people are. We saw a lot of folks out with their kids, sort of some of the Washington, D.C. brunch crowd, people with their dogs, and then some sort of die-hard protesters. Were you here to protest, sir? No? You weren't here? No. Again, people sort of looking around, waiting to see what they're going. Were you all here to protest? Nope, they weren't here to protest either. It's difficult sometimes to find and separate that in this crowd. A lot of people coming in from out of town also here sort of to watch the skeptical. The one thing, Chris and Shannon, that we resonated from the speakers, and you can see a lot of the people with their signs here that we're talking about, is that this is much more than just about Brett Kavanaugh. They were resigned today pretty much that they had lost the battle here about Brett Kavanaugh. Really, Shannon, what we are hearing now, and Chris, is this issue of trying to turn this into the larger war for November. A lot of talk about it's only 31 days to the midterms. A lot of rallying cries now for trying to get people out to the polls, and not only get them to the polls, but also to get them fired up to work and to organize for Democratic congressmen and senators ahead of November, guys.
Leland, I see that there's still quite a crowd there, particularly outside the Capitol building. The vote is over. The senators are going home. Is there going to be an event? Is there going to be a rally? Or what are they waiting for, I suppose?
Great question. And depending on who you ask, you get a different answer. To set the scene for you, this is the Supreme Court building, equal justice under the law. That's where they've sort of all gathered. This Capitol Police threw everybody off of the Capitol steps a couple of hours ago, and people who didn't want to leave were arrested. Ma'am, can we talk to you for a second? Nope, doesn't want to talk either. So it's sometimes difficult to figure out exactly what the plan is here. There's about 6 or 7 different groups that we've been able to find out here, and then you get about 5 or 6 different answers from each of them about what's planned next, Chris. So we'll be waiting. When it happens, you'll be the first one to find out.
All right, Leland Vitter, thank you very much. We'll check back with you. In the meantime, if you're just joining us, it is official. Judge Brett Kavanaugh has been confirmed as the 114th Justice of the Supreme Court. Joining us now with some perspective, Dana Perino, host of the Daily Briefing here on Fox News. She joins us from New York. All right, Dana, listen, you have more personal connection and networking with the Kavanaughs than most of us do, having worked in Bush 43 White House. How do you think their family must feel after what they've been through to get to this day?
I was thinking about that, possibly completely shattered in terms of exhaustion, relieved, possibly a little euphoria as well. And also maybe quite reflective. I think that one of the things you saw from Brett Kavanaugh when he testified is he talked about his faith. He has a strong faith in the Lord, and that he was relying on that faith in order to help get him through. He also reveres the Constitution, loves the Constitution and the law. And maybe after tonight, I think he's probably already thinking ahead to the cases that will come before the Supreme Court, the major issues that this country has to grapple with when it comes to liberty, when it comes to privacy, all the challenges that the country are facing. I hope that he and his wife and daughters and family can take a moment to celebrate. They have been through a lot. The country has been through a lot. And I think when he wrote the op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that some people love, some people criticize, I think he was trying to signal that the judge that he was for 12 years, where you have the record of over 300 opinions, that is the kind of judge he will be on the Supreme Court. So I think, Shannon, that's probably what is on his mind right now, and possibly also a lot of gratitude for the president who first hired him in the Bush 43 White House and put him on the circuit court, but then the president who stuck by him and nominated him and stuck by him, and that is President Trump, who goes now tonight to Kansas for a rally with a significant campaign promise kept, and also just a unified Republican Party, unlike we have seen in possibly 10 years.
Dana, I want to ask you on a kind of personal level about Brett Kavanaugh, because you did work with him in the Bush 43 White House. And for those of us who've been following him in public on TV, there really have been three Brett Kavanaughs we've seen. First of all, the legal scholar, immensely comfortable discussing judicial decisions, rulings, precedents in his original Judiciary Committee briefing. Then the interview with our colleague Martha McCallum, where he seemed very constrained, very uncomfortable, understandably so, dealing with the charges. And then the kind of Kavanaugh unplugged that we saw in his second Judiciary Committee testimony, when he was very fiery and really took on the Democrats in a very contentious way. Your view, which is the real Brett Kavanaugh?
Well, I think, look, he's a total human, right? He's the full spectrum. He's exceedingly gracious, also an exceeding intellectual. I'll remember one thing, Chris. In 2005, I was a spokesperson for John Roberts. He had just been nominated to replace Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who, if you'll remember, she resigned, and it was quite a surprise to everyone. But President George W. Bush had a list of possible nominees. John Roberts was the choice. And I remember as a press officer, I was getting so many questions, so many legal questions I couldn't answer. I'll never forget. It was a Friday night about 7:30 p.m. If you've ever waited tables, I felt like I was in the weeds. That means you're just out of control. You have too many requests. You don't know what to do with them. About 7:30 at night on a summer evening, and I went downstairs to the staff secretary's office, and he was still there, as usual. And I knocked on the door, and I said, "I'm sorry to bother you, Brett, but I need some help." And he sat with me for about an hour and 30 minutes and explained to me all of these different cases I was being asked about, one of them being Roe v. Wade and the right to privacy and that connection there, and explaining how this had happened in the Supreme Court over a long period of time. And then you could go out with him at night and have a good time and a laugh. I never saw any bad behavior by Brett Kavanaugh, only an exceedingly gracious person.
Thank you, Dana, very much. We'll check back in with you. All right, joining us now, South Dakota Senior Senator John Thunes, also the Senate Republican Conference Chairman. Senator, you got this across the finish line. How do you feel right now?
Very historic, Shannon. This is a terrific day for the American people. This is why Republicans got elected. It was because we were committed to putting judges on the court who are going to apply the law and the Constitution as it is written. And that is what Judge Kavanaugh represents. And so we think this is a great day for America. It's a great day for the Supreme Court, and it's a great day for the rule of law.
I know that people focus on these moments, but you all do get things done. There are actually things that are done in a bipartisan manner, things that get passed on the Hill. But there seem to be some great wounds and divisions between friendships and relationships across the aisle right now. What's your feeling on that front? I mean, do you pick up and go back to work, mend these relationships? How does it work from here?
Well, I mean, there are lots of things, as you pointed out, and bills that we passed this week. We passed major pieces of legislation. I was down at the White House yesterday for a bill signing ceremony with the president. He signed it into law. Things are getting done. Things will get done going forward. But this is an unfortunate chapter, and it's an unfortunate chapter because of the way in which Democrats cynically exploited this letter from Dr. Ford at the 11th hour to try and sink this nomination, and it didn't work. I think the American people understand what's at stake here, and I think the message that we are sending is that an unproven, unsubstantiated, uncorroborated accusation from your high school years doesn't forever disqualify you from public service. And so this nomination moved forward. We got it to where we are today. We're excited about the confirmation vote and think that Judge Kavanaugh is going to be a great justice on the Supreme Court.
Senator Thune, there are some people who suggest one of the reasons that these Supreme Court fights have become so political is actually because of a failure by Congress to get more done, that you don't solve, you collectively, not you personally, right, sir, the great issues, whether it's immigration or other key issues. And as a result, a lot of these political issues end up before the court, and they have to step in because of the void. Do you think there's some legitimacy to that complaint?
You know, I think, Chris, that it can always be argued that the legislative process is slow and arduous and cumbersome, and that's the way the founders designed it, particularly, of course, as we know here in the Senate. but we don't need a super legislature on the Supreme Court. And I think that what you see here is two very distinct judicial philosophies. One, the Democrats being, we want a super legislature. We want to get the outcomes that we desire in a matter of a political process. We don't believe that's what the court is about. We think the court historically and to this day needs to be about being that umpire that calls balls and strikes in an even-handed way that is fair in the way that it handles these cases and faithful to the law and the Constitution. We believe that's what the role of a justice is, and I do think that there's probably been a deviation from that for a long time now, and we think that the kinds of judges the president is nominating, the kinds of judges that we're processing and confirming, both to the lower courts and, of course, now to the Supreme Court, represent the kind of justice that I think people in this country expect and what our founders intended.
Senator John Thune, thank you, sir, for your time.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Chris.
All right, we've got much more live coverage ahead soon. To be Justice Kavanaugh could join the court as early as Tuesday. Welcome back to our special live coverage. Judge Brett Kavanaugh confirmed as the 114th Justice on the U.S. Supreme Court.
And now, seconds ago, President Trump applauding and congratulating the Senate for confirming him in his words, our great nominee, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, to the United States Supreme Court later today. I will sign his commission of appointment, and he will be officially sworn in. Very exciting.
All right, well, he faces a big workload, so he's got to get sworn in and get busy. Back to cases on Tuesday. The final vote was 50-48. Jennifer Griffin joins us now from the scene over on Capitol Hill. What's it like there, Jennifer?
Well, Shannon, we have been speaking to senators as they left the Senate floor. We're here in the basement of the Russell Senate office building. We just spoke to Senator Patrick Leahy, who questioned why the rush to confirm Justice Kavanaugh. He said if the Republicans have nothing to hide, then why rush? The mood among Democrats resigned, I would say. I spoke to Senator Tim McCain. He spoke about looking forward to the November elections. If you look at the Senate floor, our longtime reporter Chad Pergram said he had never seen so many disruptions during a Senate vote. There were an unprecedented number of protesters in the gallery in those 121 seats. You had when Senator Flake stood up, you heard one protester shout, "Coward." It matched the mood outside on the Capitol steps earlier today when we were there. About 200 protesters broke through a barricade, made their way to the Capitol steps. Some of them were arrested. A lot of anger among particularly women voters. They are looking at those women in the Senate, 23 women senators, 17 of them Democrats, 6 of them Republicans. The most prominent Republican, Susan Collins. All eyes will be on her Senate seat in Maine. She's up for re-election in 2020. There's already a political action committee that's been formed. And as of the last few days, there's $3 million in that PAC to unseat Susan Collins in Maine. So a lot of emotions here on Capitol Hill. Democrats who we spoke to who left the Senate vote resigned to the fact that there is a new Supreme Court justice. They couldn't stop the vote from taking place today, and they lost 50-48. Back to you, Shannon.
And Jennifer, let me ask you, a lot of the different members we've talked to this week have been very resistant. A lot of them don't like to have security or Capitol Police with them all the time. They like to be folks who can walk around Capitol Hill to their homes or whatever they want to do. But then many of them told me this week they were sort of left with no option. Is that still sort of the feeling up there, or some of the folks that you've run into, are they on their own? Are they just with staff? I mean, what's the sense today?
Well, I think it's calmed down quite considerably since yesterday. Yesterday was very tense. The public was still allowed into these Senate office buildings. It was very tense. The confrontations in front of offices. Someone like Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona couldn't even return to his Senate office and was seen on the House side yesterday because of so many protesters outside his office. Today, much calmer, much more orderly. The protesters were pretty much limited to in front of the Supreme Supreme Court and that moment when they broke through the barricades and made their way up to the Capitol Hill steps. But even then, it wasn't really tense. The police had things under control, and it was orderly as they led those away who were being arrested. But they were willing to be arrested. That was part of the protest today. So a lot of emotions, I'd say, but most of them out in front of the Capitol, in front of the Supreme Court, not here in the halls of the Senate office buildings, which are closed to the public today. Shannon.
Jennifer, thanks so much. Our special coverage of the historic confirmation vote for the next Supreme Court Justice, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, continues in a moment.
Yeah, we just reported the president's reaction by tweet. So now, next, we'll take you live to Chief White House correspondent John Roberts for more in just a minute. Stick around.
On this vote, the ayes are 50, the nays are 48. The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
Vice President Mike Pence announcing the culmination of 14 weeks of controversy, the official confirmation of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court.
Now, President Trump currently on the campaign trail, supposed to be taking off for Kansas. He's expected to make some remarks after the final vote. He said he wants to save that. First of all, though, I think we're hearing that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is going to make some remarks first. Then we'll go to the White House. Let's check in on this conference.
Kavanaugh, and congratulate him on his victory. And also the President. It's a good day for America and an important day for the Senate. We stood up for the presumption of innocence. We refused to be intimidated by the mob of people that were coming after Republican members at their homes and in the halls. I couldn't be prouder of the Senate Republican Conference. We also want to thank Senator Manchin for helping us. And with that, I'll be happy to take a few questions. Yep.
In your floor speech, you talked about that this has been a dark period and you hope that after this vote you can turn the page to a brighter day. I'm just interested, based on what we've seen the last 3 weeks where both parties have lobbed at one another, we've seen the last 5 years. How do you get to that point after this?
Sorry to interrupt you, but we've seen both sides of the Senate during the same period. During the same period we were having this huge argument over the Supreme Court. We passed an opioid bill that had been done on a bipartisan basis and a 5-year FAA extension. We just completed doing the best job on appropriations in 20 years. So we were both able to have a big, robust fight over something both sides felt deeply about and still work together on other issues at the very same time.
But do you think, I mean, senators are angry, right? In your side and on the Democratic side, they're like viscerally mad.
These things always blow over. And I think even though there may have been some anger expressed during this particular fight, as I just said, at the very same time, I know it wasn't very newsworthy for you guys because they won by big margins. We were doing important things together that hadn't been done in a long time.
Mr. Leader. Mr. Leader. Mr. Leader. Okay. Mr. Leader, I have 2 questions for you. First, how do you view what impact this is going to have on the court?
I called on the woman behind you.
Okay. Sorry.
Do you have any concerns that if Democrats later control the White House and the Senate, that they could confirm a more partisan Supreme Court justice in the future?
Well, a little history lesson. I've given this to you guys before, but the executive calendar was always done on a simple majority basis until Bush 43 got elected. Always. Even though it was possible to filibuster, it simply wasn't done. So this notion of filibustering executive branch appointments is a relatively new thing, invented, ironically, by my counterpart, currently the Democratic leader of the Senate, who began to encourage the Democrats to use filibusters against circuit court appointments during Bush 43's first term. And then you saw this evolve through several different phases over the next 15 years, leading us right back to where we were before. And there were plenty of contentious nominations when the filibuster was still possible. The most conspicuous example of that, Clarence Thomas's confirmation. Came out of committee with a negative vote, went to the floor, was confirmed 52 to 48, and all of you know it only takes one senator, just one, to make us get 60 votes. Nobody did. So we are simply back to dealing with the executive calendar on a simple majority basis as we did for 230 years or so down to Bush. And I don't think, this is going to, it'll advantage the other side at some point, as it always did down through history.
Leader McConnell, what do you think the impact of this will be on the fall midterm election and going forward? Do you think this has long or short-term ramifications for the party?
Well, it certainly had a good impact for us. Our base is fired up. We finally discovered the one thing that would fire up the Republican base, and we didn't think of it. The other side did it. The tactics that have been employed both by Judiciary Committee Democratic senators and by the virtual mob that's assaulted all of us in the course of this process has turned our base on fire. I was talking to two of my political advisors yesterday about the advantage that these guys, by their tactics, have given to us going into these red state competitive races. And we're pretty excited. They managed to deliver the only thing we had not been able to figure out how to do, which was to get our folks fired up. The other side is obviously fired up. They have been all year.
And do you think there's any long-term ramifications in the way the women view the party, and women that are here in the halls saying they've had these situations?
You mean women like Senator Collins and Senator Fisher and Senator Hyde-Smith and Senator Ernst? This was about treating someone fairly. This was about evidence being relevant, not about unsubstantiated charges. Cheryl.
Senator, you've heard several of your colleagues say that the country needs to heal, the Senate needs to heal. Do you think that the country and the Senate need to heal after this? And so what are you going to do to make that happen?
Well, I just finished reading John Meacham's latest book, which is kind of a trip through American history and some of the more challenging periods we've had. This is nowhere near as challenging as some of the experiences we've had in the past throughout our history. The Senate and the country will get past this. We always do. The geniuses who put together this Constitution knew what they were doing, and we've had plenty of low points in our history, and I think this is nowhere near the lowest points we've experienced. The McCarthy era, the rise of the Klan in the 20s after Woodrow Wilson premiered Birth of a Nation in the White House. We've had some other low points. We always get past them.
You mentioned Senator Collins. Democrats are now saying that she is their top target for 2020. What can you say about the levels?
It's my top priority, too.
McConnell. Yes, Senator Lindsey Graham had an interesting statement the other day when he said, citing the Merrick Garland standard, he himself would not consider a Supreme Court nominee once the 2020 presidential primaries have begun. Will you take the same pledge?
Now, look, let's talk about 2016. I'm glad you brought it up. You'd have to go back to 1888 to find the last time a Senate controlled by a different party than the president filled a vacancy created during a presidential election year. I knew full well, based upon what Joe Biden had volunteered in 1992 and Chuck Schumer and Harry Reid had volunteered in 2007, that who controls the Senate when you have a vacancy that close to the election makes a big difference. There's not a doubt in anybody's mind here, I'm sure, that if the shoe was on the other foot in 2016, and there'd been a Republican president making a nomination to a Democratic Senate, it wouldn't have been filled. So we'll see what it looks like in 2020. First, do we have a vacancy? Second, who's in charge of the Senate?
So not closing the
On
possibility.
Mr. Leader, if there was another vacancy, say if Ruth Bader Ginsburg were to leave the court, would you encourage the president to put another conservative judge in that seat?
Of course.
One more, Leader. Mr. Leader, how do you view this in the context of your legacy?
I was just wondering, will you try to encourage more of the female Republican women to join the Judiciary Committee after all of this?
You know, that's a really good question. We've encouraged several of our women senators to go on the committee, and I intend to do that again at the beginning of the next session. Their particular priorities have not, I mean, there's been no effort to avoid it. I've tried to encourage them to do it, obviously without success, and we'd love to have one of our women senators on Judiciary, and hopefully that'll be the case next year. Thanks a lot.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell wrapping up his post-confirmation news conference. I said earlier in our interview with Senator McConnell, Shannon, that he is not a deeply or outwardly emotional man. That was about as ebullient, as ecstatic, as rollicking as Mitch McConnell gets, and rightly so. He has made putting conservatives on the court, not just at the Supreme Court, but the Court of Appeals and the district courts, perhaps his top priority, because he thinks it has the greatest long-term effect on the country. And to now have put 26, which is at this point a record for this soon into a new presidency, 26 confirmed members for the Court of Appeals and now 2 Supreme Court justices, a big deal, a real accomplishment for Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, it's been his priority since the moment he said he would hold that Justice Antonin Scalia seat open back in February, a couple years back during the presidential year. All right, we're just getting some brand new information, too, that Judge Brett Kavanaugh is going to be sworn in later today. There are 2 different oaths that a new justice takes. So one will be administered by Chief Justice John Roberts, the other by retired Associate Justice Anthony Kennedy. And you may remember that Judge Kavanaugh actually clerked for Judge Kennedy, along with Justice Gorsuch. Both of them clerked together at the same time there. So that's where we are today. That'll happen today because there's a lot of work waiting for him. And they say they, quote, want him to get to work immediately on that.
No time for celebrations. He's got to read court briefs, right?
They're
in cases next week.
Yeah, they are, starting on Tuesday. Okay, so let's go now to the White House. Let's check in with the White House correspondent, John Roberts, from the North Lawn there. Busy day, and they're not wasting any time putting him to work, John.
Well, you are the master of understatement there, Shannon. No question about that. Hey, there's going to also be a ceremonial swearing in of Judge Kavanaugh that will happen here at the White House. That's likely to be maybe on Monday afternoon or very early on Tuesday. I think Monday afternoon probably more likely because they want to get him seated on the court on Tuesday. The president, who is now winging his way to Topeka, Kansas, will have more information on that. And I expect that we'll probably hear from the president when he touches down in Topeka, though we do have a statement from him on Twitter in which he says, quote, I applaud and congratulate the U.S. Senate for confirming our great nominee, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, to the United States Supreme Court. Later today, I will sign his commission of appointment, and he will be officially sworn in. Very exciting. Now, the president is going to a political rally tonight in Topeka that is for Chris Kobach, who's running for governor there, and Steve Watkins, who's running for Congress. But this is going to be the president's rally, and this is going to be a huge victory lap for the president because he was up against the ropes with this nomination. But to mix some sports metaphors here, he dug in his cleats, partially based on his own personal experience of having accusations leveled at him, and refused to give up Kavanaugh. He knew that to do so was probably going to be really, really bad politically in terms of the midterm elections because it could really dampen Republican enthusiasm. But the president now can say to his constituents, I promised you a conservative judge. We had an opening, and we've got one in. Shannon? Chris?
All right. John Roberts live at the White House. We'll check back with you shortly. In the meantime, we've got to take a quick break. More live coverage right after this.
Early in the roll call, before we came on to the national Fox network, there was quite a lot of disruption. In fact, very unusual amount of disruption in the Senate gallery. There are 121 public seats there, and anyone after they pass through security can come and sit in the gallery. And in fact, they're strictly admonished. You're not allowed to show either any support or any disagreement with any decision or any statement that's made. You're there to sit and watch the senators do what they did. But when they began the roll call, it sounded mostly like female voices shouting very much in opposition to the Kavanaugh nomination, and particularly when Jeff Flake, who was considered one of the key swing votes, was voting for Kavanaugh, you could hear one of the female protesters up in the Senate gallery shout and call Flake a coward, and she was escorted out. We're told of those 121 seats left.
Mr. Carper.
Here we go. Waiting for some stragglers, and I can tell you these senators.
Carper, no.
Waiting for stragglers, and as I say, these senators very much want to get on planes and fly home. It is a holiday weekend, and they want to go back to their states, but they're waiting for this vote to be completed. So whoever it is that hasn't voted yet is not going to be popular.
Looks like we got the final vote in that we're going to get today.
As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate gallery. Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or change a vote? If not, on this vote, the ayes are 50, the nays are 48. The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask consent the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
I suggest the absence of quorum.
Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The clerk will call the roll.
And so after 3 long months, the nomination, which came on July 9th, and the confirmation